I've been instructed to not just obviously moderate the panel, which I'm really excited about, but first to give some opening remarks. Before I do that, though, I want to make sure that we introduce this incredibly esteemed panel that's been put together. So all the way to my right is Marty Wachs, who is, or Martin Wachs, but my mentor is a great friend of Martin, so I know him as Marty. He is truly one of the most respected thinkers and therefore voices in the transportation and land use space across the country. 3 times the chair of the UCLA Department of Urban Planning, right? Just some kind of side stuff. It's an incredibly voluminous career, and you can easily find all of his work online in both academic journals and a lot of other publications that you read. To his left is Tom Kirk, who's the executive director of the Coachella Valley Association of Governments, right? Did I say that right? So obviously your neighbors further to the east, for those of you who are living in the greater Los Angeles metropolitan area, they have an incredible set of responsibilities around environmental stewardship and transportation. And what's incredibly cool for us for today's conversation is that Tom has experience both in the public and private sector, both on the city council level, other executive directorships with regional governments. And so I think we can learn a lot from what's happening both there and his prior experiences. Then to his left is Karol Denniston, who is a partner with Squire, Patton, Boggs, a Cleveland firm, actually, right? With over 30 years of experience in a whole range of bankruptcy-related and other litigation issues, Karol is incredibly well informed, especially about the pension issues that we're going to be hearing about today. She's a member of both the Texas and California bar, and we were just learning about before we came up here, has seen places all over the world. But on this pension point, it's especially relevant to what we're going to be talking about today. Because infrastructure is really, when it comes down to it, is a huge public responsibility, even in private components of it, like energy and broadband. And because it has such big public components, the fiscal health of our regions is paramount to understanding what we can build, how we can maintain it, and how we can make sure that infrastructure is the shared platform that allows economic growth and prosperity to impact our metropolitan and smaller, micropolitan, even rural areas that you find not just in states like California, but all over the United States. So what are the pressing issues that we're facing here in the country right now? Well, in some ways, there's almost too many to list. But I play a transportation economist many parts of my day. So thinking about, I think the way I tend to think about infrastructure is I try to think back to how it was, I'm not old at all, but how I thought about it before I had to work in it every day. And that's what makes people so informed about infrastructure is they use it. They know what they think about it. It's not some far off kind of distant policy sector. And what is infrastructure to most people? It's not a set of concrete or tubes or different kinds of pipes. It's actually very much how you are able to do the things, and I mean that in a generalist way, the things you want to do every day. Now, what are some of the core challenges that are facing our built environment systems that help us get to where we need to go? Well, number one is, and it's very much a pressing issue both in Southern California and all over the state, but as well as national, is economic inclusion. We are dealing in an age of some of the most disparate income levels, right, by different shares of our population. And that both income gap, which exacerbates itself as also a wealth gap, is making life very difficult for many people. And one of the ways that we see it's difficult, and it's something that you all know here in California, both in the northern and southern half, is property is getting incredibly expensive. Now, there are some funky levers here in the state, which I will learn from others. I don't need to wax poetic to you about it. But when it is difficult for people to afford where they live, and there are challenges in the incomes that people earn from their jobs, it causes all kinds of challenges to our day-to-day lives, and it causes challenges on our infrastructure systems. California is no different than other states across the country, where sprawl is a very intense challenge for us to deal with. Now, we tend to think about those distances that people have to drive, and as I told my colleagues here, it's one of my first experiences in this portion of Southern California, and I had to leave early enough coming from the beach to come here, where I was staying with my wife, whatever set of highways I was moving on, I couldn't list out the numbers. I'm thinking about that Saturday Night Live skit right now, but the numbers I was passing on, we were moving really nice and smooth, but you saw it on the other side of folks moving in from the Inland Empire and other places into what I presume is various parts of greater Los Angeles, right? The cars weren't moving. And I joked with Tom and Karol in particular. I'm like, well, I think it's going to take them a while to get to where they're going to need to go. And I think Tom even said, yeah, they'll get there tomorrow. So those kind of challenges, right, we kind of live those on a day-to-day basis, but those are very real on our infrastructure systems too, right? So how can we make sure that in an era where there are extreme resilience challenges, people sometimes call it sustainability too, these all mix into a pot, right? That how can we make sure we have a built environment that is both sustainable for all of us, a shared responsibility we carry, that it connects people to opportunity, and that we do it in such a way, both through the public sector almost exclusively, also in partnerships with our private sector colleagues in some of those systems, and then in just a regulatory fashion with our private sector partners who build out entire systems. How can we do that in such a way that it connects all of us to economic opportunity, and we do so in such a way at the same time that is fiscally responsible? So the topics that are on the table here today are incredibly important. They impact probably many of you at your daily jobs. They impact every single resident of this state, and they certainly impact the entire country. So with that said, let me give you a little bit of ground rules for how we're going to see the next about 30 minutes or so go, and then what's going to happen after that. So we're going to have dealer's choice here. The panelists can either sit in their seats and give presentations. They can head to the podium. Either will work. Each is going to give about 10 minutes remarks about a set of kind of core issues here that touch on topics of both their expertise and apply to the state. After that, I'm going to also reserve the opportunity to kind of toss some questions around. Hopefully we'll get some dialogue going. And then after that, hopefully if we have some time left, we can go to you in the audience and get an even bigger dialogue happening. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Marty.
Thank you very much. The idea that America's infrastructure is crumbling began with a book by Choate and Walter called America in Ruins, that was published in 1981. So it's nearly 40 years that we have been repeating and repeating and repeating that America's infrastructure is in ruins. But is it really in ruins? Actually, our infrastructure is quite diverse, and some of it is quite in wonderful condition, and new and shiny and modern, while some of it is definitely in shambles and deeply in need of our attention. But the point I would like to leave with you, the single most important point that I want to emphasize in everything that I say, is that where our infrastructure is great, where it's really working, it's the result of good governance, of partnerships between federal, state, and local authorities that have actually worked and that have been efficient. And where it's in shambles, it's because of our inability to come to agreements and our continuous arguing over the quality and the nature of our projects. So for two examples from New York, and later I'm going to give two examples from California, the Tappan Zee Bridge north of New York has been replaced by the Mario Cuomo Bridge. It took 11 months, it's almost a record short time, to get all the permits needed to start building. It was a partnership of many funding agencies with federal contributions and state contributions, and it's open to traffic, and it's a modern facility. Meanwhile, to the south, approaching Penn Station, the so-called Gateway Project, the two rail tunnels that carry 275,000 commuters every day into Manhattan from New Jersey and then back in the afternoon, is leaking, it's collapsing. It was flooded by Hurricane Sandy, and the two states, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, the City of New York, have all been fighting over how to finance its replacement. The federal government has been on the scene and then withdrew its promised support. So it's now been 30 to 40 years, and we're still arguing about it. I'm trying to illustrate that the point is that it's not that we don't have enough money, it's that we can't agree on how to go forward and govern our expenditures of that money. So the next several slides show the big picture, and I think they'll show that yes, federal funding and state funding on infrastructure is declining a little or largely remaining stable, But it's not that we don't have enough money or that our expenditures are plummeting. What you will see when you see the numbers is some patterns, but the numbers don't say what what we're spending is wise, whether we're spending on the right projects or wasting money on poor projects. The numbers first just give a pattern of what we're actually spending. So capital is spending on new facilities and major expansions of existing facilities, as opposed to the other categories, operations and maintenance. Is almost obviously the day-to-day cost of operating and fixing the systems. Total federal, state, and local spending on infrastructure has been falling since 2002, but was rising quite substantially for a very long period until that time period. And you see capital spending almost mirrors it, but it's of course a part of the total, because the rest is the operations and maintenance. And that too has been falling since 2002. The stimulus package, which was during the so-called Great Recession, was intended to bring an uptick in that spending, and it did, but only temporarily and also not very dramatically, as you can see where that arrow points. So operations and maintenance spending has been steadily rising when we take into account not just the federal contributions, but the state and local contributions. So capital spending by state and local governments and operations and maintenance spending by state and local governments far outweighs what the federal government spends. And we hope, of course, that the federal government spends its money in such a way as to influence local and state money to spend that money in more efficient ways. But you can actually see that if you correct for inflation, that the spending isn't dramatically declining. The problem is not that, it's the aging of our infrastructure. So again, federal operations and maintenance is a very small proportion of our total expenditures, and this slide shows how state and local operations and maintenance expenditures far outweigh it. So especially in California, when we're talking about infrastructure, we're talking largely about our own money. Now you can look at public spending in different ways. This is federal spending on infrastructure per capita over the years, and you see that it increased with the interstate highway system in the 50s and 60s, but then remained relatively constant over a very long period of time. And while it is declining, the decline is not dramatic. If we look at it as a percentage of our gross domestic product, also it is declining and rising, going up and down, but again, not dramatically declining to a point that we would say we are in ruins. Highway spending has been going down, but that's because, in part, the interstate system was built out in the 80s and 90s, and transit and rail spending has been rising. As we see that all around the country, there are more new subway systems and rail lines under construction than highways. Water utility spending has been going up a little bit, but that's primarily local government spending. And national spending on water resources more generally, river improvements and dams, hydroelectric plants, is remaining flat, but it's small in comparison with, for example, highway spending. So how does infrastructure funding flow? And these next slides are a little bit complicated, but I think informative. I hope so, at least. They show that the federal government actually only spends $2 billion on its own projects and funds, mostly on military bases and national parks and so on. But the federal government raises $58 billion a year that it spends on infrastructure, mostly by sending $45 billion of that to the states and $11 billion directly to local governments, bypassing the states. The states also raise about $89 billion, more than federal, for infrastructure, and they spend $108 billion directly on state projects that include state-raised money and federal transfers the money from the federal government. And the states also send to local governments 26 billion. I read the B as an 8. What happens is that the states send some of the money to local governments, and some of what they send to local governments has come to the state from the federal government, but some is raised directly by by the state government. So local governments spend another 110 billion, of which they raise 73 billion locally, but they get quite a bit of distribution from the states and from the Fed. Now, obviously, there are many sources of this money. Some of it is general revenue, our income taxes and sales taxes. Some of it is, at local levels, raised by municipal bonds. And individual citizens and investment houses and pension funds and so on can invest in municipal bonds and in part finance infrastructure that way. A large part of it, very important part, is user fees. We charge people for water when they consume it. We charge gasoline taxes for the use of highways. And in California, it's now a substantial amount. It's approaching 70 cents a gallon with the new increase last November from SB1. And we also have toll roads where people pay directly and finance the roads on which they are driving. There's a great deal of talk about public-private partnerships, and mostly thus far, our real partnerships are public-public partnerships, and the private sector has contributed relatively little. So this, I'm not sure if I have a pointer. So look at the last 3 columns and notice that the private sector total of contributions in infrastructure is actually quite minuscule. It's about $12 billion compared with public contributions of over $400 billion. And if you look down that column of private, you'll see that most of that money is in railroads, and that's because railroads are still private industries, and the rights of way and the rolling stock for freight railroads are owned by private holdings. So most of the infrastructure spending is is government spending. Federal government is a small proportion, but it's vital to match local and state funding. And the private sector is almost a blip on the screen, a tiny little blip, except for railroads. And if you look at that curve to the bottom right, what that shows is that the private contributions, however, are growing rapidly. That's the last few years, and you see that it's a very rapidly upturning curve. So with every successful project, there is behind it some kind of a partnership. And 2 examples from California. If you've driven across the Golden Gate Bridge recently, you notice that Doyle Drive, the Presidio on the south end of the bridge, have all been rebuilt. That was funded by a partnership of 13 contributing public agencies and carried out by a private company under a public-private partnership. 13 contributing agencies, including the county, the state, the federal government. Nearer to here, within just a few miles of where we're sitting, we're beginning a project to remove the busiest and most dangerous railroad grade crossing in the state at the intersection of Rosecrans and Marquardt, and it's the BNSF Railroad. And they have contributed along with 11 public agencies to get that project going. It will place an underpass under the tracks and prepare the tracks for high-speed rail in the near future. Every successful project also is a partnership that usually involves many different sources of financing. User fees in transportation are very important, in water, very important. Gas taxes, tolls, water bills pay a lot of the cost. We obviously pay some of it out of our government's current revenue. We borrow against future revenue using bonds, and we assemble packages of these sorts. They're very challenging, but where we're successful with infrastructure, that's what we've done. So my last slide says, it ain't easy, but let's talk about it. It's a challenge for governance, not so much for raising more money. We're spending quite a lot. We're saying our infrastructure is broken, but that doesn't make anything better. Successful projects are politically and financially complex. Federal policy should, to the extent that it can, promote partnerships, state and local governments and the private sector, and doing so doesn't depend upon hyperbole. It's really a lot of hard work. Local governments, and including like LA County, has now committed to hundreds of billions of transportation improvements through sales tax entirely locally. Of course, trying to get federal and state contributions. Local governments can't wait for the federal government to lead. So those are my main points, and let's explore them in our continuing conversation. Thank you very much.
Marty ended on a point of partnerships and funding partnerships. And what you'll see in my presentation is we perform a couple different roles in the Coachella Valley. We fund and build transportation infrastructure, and we also protect the environment. We run an energy program, and sometimes those objectives conflict. More often, they're synergistic. And I noted, Marty pointed out, the successful partnerships actually involve multiple funding sources and political will. If you look deep into the budgets of Desert Hot Springs or Coachella or Palm Desert, you'd actually see that each of those small cities contributes to funding big projects in the Coachella Valley that are outside of their jurisdiction. And we actually fund in the Coachella Valley based on who's benefiting, not where the project is. And even if it's a few dollars from those small cities, it goes a long way. So this is a conversation about split personalities. And in the Coachella Valley, I try to run something called CVAG, where we fund transportation infrastructure. I also try to run something called the Coachella Valley Conservation Commission. And again, you'd think building infrastructure and then protecting the environment may be two different things. In some ways, they are absolutely synergistic. So in the Coachella Valley, much like in the regions you live and work, we look at our transportation infrastructure. We don't use the words falling apart, believe it or not. I'm a big believer that our infrastructure is actually pretty darn good. And you look at things like bridge deficiency reports. That's based on today's standards. It doesn't mean the bridge is going to fall down, but a lot of our bridges are in fantastic shape. But we do take a look at our infrastructure, and we note, as you did on your drive from Venice this morning, that in places we do have extreme congestion. We study that problem, we identify solutions, and whether that fill is a dike or a pipe or infrastructure or recharge ponds or transmission lines. We assess those impacts, and just about everybody here is from California, or will be one day, and they always get here eventually. We assess those impacts, and Michelle, we do so in the context of CEQA, certainly, in the state of California. And after that, we of course go out and build the project, right? Well, not exactly. We usually get sued. And then we go out and build the project. And the lawsuit, of course, could be the Bunny Rabbit, it could be the Center for Biological Diversity, it could be the Sierra Club. More likely, it's the neighbor that's using the Bunny Rabbit as a reason to stop a project. And that's the context we work in California. Well, and then we go out and mitigate the project, whether it's a housing development or a transportation piece of infrastructure. And sometimes the mitigation is really, really foolish. It's stupid. You might, let's say you're a housing developer and you're on 100 acres. Do you protect 2 acres of the 100 acres for the wetlands on the property? You could spend a lot of money doing that frankly is wasteful. It's wasteful for the developer and the infrastructure builder. It's wasteful, frankly, on the environmental end too. Saving the 2 acres on a 100-acre piece of property instead of saving an entire wetland system in a regional context, I'd prefer to do the latter. And in the Coachella Valley, as well as Western Riverside County, we have something called multiple species habitat conservation plans. And the idea with these plans is, instead of mitigating project by project, hiring a biologist, hiring an attorney, doing a whole lot of work on a specific piece of property, we've tried to simplify the process. And what we've tried to do is set up certainly a separate organization that I mentioned, We're protecting about 21 conservation areas in the Coachella Valley. This is a map of the Coachella Valley. The areas in green are the mountains surrounding the Coachella Valley. If you've been to Palm Springs or Palm Desert, you know what I'm talking about. Since this is all about the bill is due, how do we pay for it? Well, if you're building a project, and let's call it a private sector development project right now, and you're in Palm Springs, or in Palm Desert, or in Coachella, when you build that project, you pay a fee. And if you're building a single house, you actually pay a fee, $1,200. And you pay $1,200 regardless of where you're building that house in the Coachella Valley. And instead of mitigating a tiny piece of property, you send it to my organization. And we actually go out and buy a bigger piece of land, and we protect it forever. It's a really efficient way of doing things. And so that's what a private developer does. What RCTC and CVAG and others do is we write a check too, and we provide land and easements. We started the program with a $20 million commitment from my other personality. The transportation side gave the habitat conservation side $20 million to start the process, get the ball rolling, buy land, and protect it. And for those of you, what's the value of paying a fee rather than going through the CEQA NEPA process? Michelle, you can't answer. Charity, neither can you. What's the value? Time, uncertainty, and who here has been to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service regional or headquarters? Who's done that? Well, you know it looks something like this. And when you're building a big piece of infrastructure, and you need to get it in, and you want to save lives, you want to be more efficient in how we use taxpayer money, you show up at U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and you have uncertainty. You don't know when the process is going to end, you don't know how much it's going to cost, and you don't know what mitigation is. These regional plans take that all away. We pay a fee. We're done with the Endangered Species Act, both federal and state. So I'm going to give you a little story that'll give you some hope. Charity was supposed to say some positive things, right? Right? So I'll give you an example of how a split personality helps. This is one of our bigger projects in the Coachella Valley, small in the context of some of the projects that Marty was showing you, but it's Bob Hope Interchange. When you go out there and you see a casino on the right, Agua Caliente Casino, you see a big piece of project, infrastructure. It's a $30 or $40 million project, and it took us, 10 years to get the project through Caltrans. Caltrans was the lead agency, and Steve, you know how this works, but RCTC or CVAG are the ones that underwrite the bill. The last dollar spent on these projects is committed to by the local agency. Going to Marty's point, that the shift in funding and responsibility is gone from federal to state and more to local or regional agencies like ours. So this was a high priority project for us. We finally got it underway. And after years of delay, here we go, we have it, we're underway, and we're under construction. 6 months into construction, I get word from the site that construction is stopped on the project. And what had happened is the materials didn't test properly. We were using sand to build a big sand mound, and the sand didn't meet specifications. And Caltrans resident engineer said, we've got to find an additional site to get sand or dirt to build the mound. That stopped a project where we'd already mobilized a lot of construction equipment. And guess who pays for the delay? The taxpayer, through my organization. So I ran down to San Bernardino, where our Caltrans office was, and said, what's going on? They said, we need some additional dirt. I said, well, we cannot have a 6-month delay on this project while Caltrans does another CEQA analysis, another environmental analysis, putting lots of time, lots of money at play. We took a look at the land that they needed, and it was outside of a conservation area. And when I have my habitat plan on, say if it's outside of a conservation area, we could do whatever we want, develop that property. Right, Ann? We took a look at that and said, what's the solution? Do we hire a biologist, engage Michelle and Charity and others, or do we say that land was going to be developed anyway? My organization called CVAG, the Transportation Builder, paid my other organization. I wrote a check to myself for $7,500. And we had this project cleared within 24 hours. And that's the value of regional cooperation and connecting the dots between our environmental goals and our transportation goals. So in my opinion, split personalities can be useful. What we are looking at is in our future, and again, Ann and Steve and others know that I couldn't get by without talking about CV Link. We're also looking at transportation projects that are a little bit different and focus not only on congestion, but providing other environmental and health benefits. We're taking the Whitewater River levee right now and creating something called CV Link, Coachella Valley Link, the largest active transportation project in the state. It's a $100 million project, which is small dollars when you're building a tunnel, but a big project for bikes and pedestrians. This is the artist's rendering. This is the actual project. We've actually built the first 2.3 miles. We'll build another mile this summer and another 10 or 15 in the next year. And the benefits, of course, are these kind of broad societal ones. And by doing all these good things, does that mean that we avoid a lawsuit? Steve? No. We got sued on this one too. So even when you do all the great things, whether particularly in the state of California, there's a hefty role for BB&K. And my last point on BB&K, I appreciate being here. We do a lot of work with BB&K on environmental work, energy work, transportation work. And I have to admit, I had the nerve about 9 months ago hiring a boutique law firm to do some other work for us. BB&K swallowed them up 30 days ago. I can't get away from you guys. I do appreciate the time and all the support you provided to me over the years. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you for the opportunity to talk about pensions. It's a complex topic, and in the 10 minutes I have, I'm going to give you the functional equivalent of a drive-by and hopefully introduce some of the topics that we'll be talking about throughout the day. I want to kind of put this in context, though. The first time I talked about pensions and said many of the things I'm going to say today, I was pretty much drummed out of the Corps. I was speaking to a group of bondholders, and they're like, this isn't a problem. And in 2009, there was complete denial. It's good to be able to say in 2018 that we've come a long way in terms of recognizing the problem, but we've also come a long way in understanding some of the complexity that surrounds it. So first of all, I kind of want to identify the scope of what I hope to cover today in my 10 minutes. We're looking at we're looking at the challenges here because there's service insolvency, which we're all aware of, that exists when the pension payments become so high that everything else has to go. That includes libraries, streetlights, roads, swimming pools, anything that's extra. It's almost like a household budget that's being cut down to the only the essentials. And one has to ask, how long can we get by with municipalities that have nothing to offer other than payment of their pensions and their bond debt and their other operating expenses? Negative cash flow is becoming a real challenge for many of the municipalities. I'll talk about that in a minute, but it's the actual dollars that aren't going to be around to make the CalPERS payments and the other pension payments and everything else as those payments increase. And then lastly, this puts pressure on infrastructure and everything else because there's no money left for capital improvements or even maintenance of some infrastructure that the municipality has. Why is this happening? Well, I'm going to focus on the big picture of CalPERS, increasing contributions, reduced amortization, unreasonable termination costs, and those things are putting pressure on municipalities now. And if we project out even 2-3 years, we see municipalities, considering that we're mostly flatline revenues in this state, don't have the cash to make those projected payments. So what has become, what was a future problem is now a today problem. And then the last thing is I want to talk a little bit about the reform efforts across the country as well as California. This slide kind of just drives home the fact that this situation's not getting any easier for the municipalities. The increase in contribution rates, the cutting of services, and I know some of you are very, very familiar with things where City Hall's been closed, but one day a week, people are collecting their own garbage, all the janitorial services have been eliminated. Sonoma County, we don't have roads, they're turning to gravel despite the efforts, and the rational analysis that says if we do some maintenance, it'll be cheaper than if we have to go back and rebuild those roads later, but it's kind of past the point of no return in Sonoma. And then we have CalPERS deciding to get healthy on the back of the municipalities by reducing amortization rates. Some of the cities that you probably are familiar with that have been in the headlines recently include Antioch, Barstow, Santa Cruz, and Martinez. There are others where we have actually seen retirees receiving reduced payments. And I get calls all the time from municipalities and from retirees saying, well, why can't we sue over this? And there's no one to pay for the lawsuit. The law doesn't really support a lawsuit because the bottom line is if the contributions aren't paid, CalPERS has the right to reduce the payments to the retirees. And that seems to be a harsh result given that we have a number of municipalities that may be looking at this very conclusion. As I said, CalPERS has reduced the discount rate to 7%. It raised the employer's contributions rates. That's going to be phased in over 8 years, but if you run the numbers, we see negative cash flow happening much sooner than the 8 years. They've also implemented a 20-year amortization schedule, which is going to be phased in over 3 years, and that means that you kind of have a double whammy if you're a municipality trying to figure out where the cash is coming from. And then there have been any number of brave parties that have tried to exit CalPERS and come up against the sort of unbelievably harsh termination payments. As we saw in Stockton, termination fee is statutory. It's going to be enforced as long as you're not in a Chapter 9 bankruptcy proceeding, but it's unworkable for anybody that's in financial distress because you can't afford to pay the discount rate when CalPERS calculates it anywhere from the 2 to 4% range that we see using. Think about the difference between that range and a 7% range, and you can quickly understand why you can't get out of CalPERS. One of the things that I think that we need to focus on in the state at a state level, though, is that what changes do we need in terms of procedures and costs for exiting CalPERS, and perhaps renegotiating amortization terms or other components of the payments. And here is where we come to loggerheads because CalPERS is trying to get its house in order by, as it says, behaving financially responsibly by increasing the contribution rates, in other words, lowering the discount rate, and reducing amortization. CalPERS says this is what we're supposed to do, we need to do this, but there's a complete, they're oblivious, one could say, intentionally oblivious to the impact that that has on the municipalities that are looking at pretty much flatline revenues, because many of the municipalities that we work with have already increased their sales tax to the highest amount, reduce the cost, and understand that there's no more there. So we have this problem with, CalPERS being more conservative, and then the tension and the knock-on effect, or I should say the knockdown effect that has on municipalities. Part of the reason we have that, you can see on the slides that, the bigger challenge is not cost cutting, it's trying to find new revenue. And why we need to look at pension reform? One of the mandates for municipalities is delivering essential services, and at some point we're going to go past the level of being able to deliver any services other than paying pensions. And that's kind of not why cities and municipalities exist. There needs to be adequate infrastructure spending, maintenance of police and fire, and a recognition that cities have to cash flow. Those of you are probably very familiar with PEPRA, and with common thread here is the PEPRA reforms and then the introductions of those reforms and the litigation that followed. To say that it continues to be bad news on the litigation front, one could say that, but one could also say that we've had some nice surprises with cases in front of the Supreme Court that you'll hear about later this afternoon, where there's a good chance that the California rule may be modified. We also have more activity in the Senate where we're looking at new proposed laws that are at least beginning to strike at the idea of pension reform. So the good news that I want to say, and I want to skip a couple of these slides because you probably are well familiar with that. The good news is that there's political change underfoot. And if you look at pension reform, it's kind of a three-legged stool in terms of a problem. There's the political side of the house, there's the financial side of the house, and then there's the side of the house for the taxpayers that are out there saying, we want to live in a city that has services. Those three things are what drive the complexity of pension reform. And when I speak with bondholder groups, they're kind of like, can't you give us the key to get rid of the political aspect of this so we can just go in and solve the problem? And I'm kind of like, that's not really the way to look at this, because the only way to solve the problem is to work through the political system. Because whenever you have a scarce allocation of resources, you're going to have to reach some agreement as to how you're going to solve the problem. And in California, we've seen propositions, local ballot initiatives, voter initiatives, state ballot initiatives. All of those things have done a good job in educating the public as to what's really happening in terms of the fact of the matter is there's too many people retiring, the costs are going up, and we're going to have to do something to address the problem. So while they might not have been successful initially, the education process has been useful, and I think is reflected by some of the Superior Court rulings we saw that have come to the conclusion that pensioners are entitled to a reasonable pension. And we've always been in a question of, well, how do we define a reasonable pension? And maybe we'll get some enlightenment from the Supreme Court. But I want to close with a couple of thoughts. The wish list here in terms of California municipalities need more state support. We have no state support. Most of the states that are successfully wrestling with pensions are doing it with oversight, supervision, and even assistance. And having worked on some of that legislation across the country, I think that's something we ought to be thinking about here. Improved municipal governance and transparency in connection with budgets, increases in pensions or pay, financial performance, and the results of your collective bargaining agreements. And then an efficient use of out-of-court restructuring, and plus recognition. Chapter 9 now is a business tool. We're beginning to understand, and at least the bondholders that I represent fully appreciate what can happen in a Chapter 9. But one of the things I often tell my municipal clients is that doesn't mean you can't call up your trustee or your bondholders and say, hey, we need to renegotiate. That's happening more and more, and 10 years ago when I started working in this process, I can't tell you the number of my clients that would say, we can't renegotiate our bond debt. You can, and it is one of the things you should think about. Predictions. We're going to continue to see employer expenditures rise faster than revenues. That's just kind of the way the projection looks like. We're going to see absence of legal or statutory reform will delay our needed reform, which means that we're going to have to begin to build some kind of consensus. Budgets are going to be unbalanced, service insolvency more severe, and voters are going to continue to drive a pension reform agenda. But on the upside, employers are going to be willing to explore more different solutions. For example, last year we worked on a situation in New Jersey where we took the lottery proceeds and essentially gave them to the pension fund to reduce the obligations. Creative, a lot of people said, oh, well, that's just a Band-Aid. Well, folks, you're going to have to put some Band-Aids on before you can fix the bigger problem. There are going to be a lot of imperfect solutions. Kind of reminds me of the quote that, what's the best of the bad solutions we have to put in place, but we're going to have to work through a process that isn't going to be perfect by a long shot. Employers are going to begin to recognize the importance of more disclosure and collective bargaining, negotiation with bondholders, and everybody in the process is going to become more adept at compromise. And I'll close by saying we can see the writing on the wall now. A lot of us are really surprised in the last couple of years when we saw the superior courts in California begin to say, you know what, we think those adjustments, even though they're minor and things that Pepper said you can't do, are appropriate, and people are only entitled to a reasonable pension. Now, what that is, we don't know yet. We're hoping that the Supreme Court will provide us some guidance. But the bottom line here is the number of people that filed briefs in support of that was a lot more than anybody expected. Some of the people that did file briefs were surprising in the sense that they were modifying their positions. And I have to say hats off to the League of Cities because they filed an amicus in favor of the changes and the lower court's rulings. That's a huge change from 2009 when the League of Cities said we'll never see pension reform. So the thing that is happening that is positive is you have taxpayers and city councils, boards of supervisors all beginning to communicate with greater understanding of the problems. The big negative in California is we don't have any state support, oversight, or supervision. You don't really have any protection when you have to make the difficult decisions about essential services. And our last thing, which is sort of like being, chained to concrete blocks and thrown in the ocean, is CalPERS has been pretty much recalcitrant in acknowledging there's a problem. I went to a recent program and there were representatives from CalPERS on the panel, and somebody said, well, how are the municipalities going to pay these increased costs that are coming as a result of the reduction discount rate and amortization? And the response was, well, they always pay. And I snorted and got a very, very dirty look. But it is almost blindness to the fact that we are rapidly approaching the point with the CalPERS members where there's not enough cash flow to make the payments. So where should our efforts go? In addition to obviously monitoring what's happening at the Supreme Court, I think we need to focus on legislative changes for CalPERS and a greater conversation with the state in terms of providing support for those municipalities that need it, whether it's oversight, supervision, professional assistance, or you could be as generous as Nevada, which provides money to assist municipalities in financial difficulty. So that's pretty much a very quick drive-by of pensions in California and elsewhere.
I'll try to kick us off, and as I've told all three of you, I really want to make sure you get conversation going, right? And I think if we can very, extremely briefly summarize, right? I think Marty, you did a great job talking about how the sky is not falling, but it replaced sky with infrastructure, right? But there's an incredible amount of state and local responsibility in that regard. Tom, you did a great job talking about some of the innovations that are happening there at the local level, including both in terms of public-public partnerships, as Marty termed them, and this kind of compromise between these dual worlds. Yeah, Karol, you got up there, and now I am scared the sky is falling, right? And how are we going to make sure that we have enough money? So here's where I want to start, right? Is that in every state, California is not unique, right? We have infrastructure needs, and in a growing state, that's always on the table. So let me throw it out to all three of you from your each unique perspectives, right? Is there enough money around that, irrespective of the current tax regime, if you will, right, to make sure that we can make those necessary investments? And that's kind of twofold, right? What would those investments be in your regard, and is there enough money around in the places that you sit on? And any order here, please.
Well, there's enough money around if we choose to spend it on infrastructure as opposed to other very important needs like healthcare and education and the environment, all of which are critically important. But the one advantage which infrastructure investments have is that they do produce user fees, and that we can finance investments by borrowing over a reasonably long period of time, because people pay tolls on roads for decades and decades. And it's interesting to note that when we talk about pensions that right near us on State Route 91, where we added express lanes and toll lanes in the median of a previously free freeway, and we got additional capacity, and people pay to use those lanes and move more quickly than on the parallel general flow lanes, that one of the major investors in that project was the Ontario Province Teachers Retirement Fund. And they saw a long-term payoff enough that they put their money at some risk, but really at a low risk. They saw it as a safe investment, whereas very few California pension funds have invested in infrastructure, and that certainly promises to be an important way that we can build infrastructure and strengthen pensions programs in the future.
And my relatively quick response is it depends on where and what. And in California, and I don't know any states much better, or any better really, infrastructure is challenging. It may not be crumbling, but we have pressing and crushing needs in Western Riverside County, in Orange County, in LA, in San Diego, in our urban centers. And we certainly could use some more money. However, when I look at the pension time bomb, I think we're doing pretty good in transportation infrastructure.
I think that what I would say is that the money is there. What we're going to have to do is figure out how to not drive off the cliff. And I think that there are solutions to that very situation. I think that how we choose to deal with our pension time bomb is going to reflect who we are as a society. Because one of the things that disturbs me the most is that when I sit in city council meetings, I talk to people that are responsible for the decision making, there's a tremendous amount of angst about the things that are no longer able to be achieved because of the pension costs. And then there's a tremendous amount of emotion and anger that's reflected toward the people that are receiving those pensions. And my first comment is we have to take the emotion out of this. I mean, we really do, because it's a financial situation that arises as a result of contracts. And equal to that, we have to be able to open up conversations with the people receiving those benefits to find solutions that will help us with the cash flow. And it is a cash flow problem. It is not a long-term problem. There's a pension bomb, yes, there's a cliff, however you want to describe it, but there are solutions for dealing with it. And the thing that most could benefit California would be everybody in unison going to Sacramento and saying we need to relook at the CalPERS rules, because my big thing with CalPERS is you got this fabulous statute that they managed to get negotiated in the 90s, and there's no check and balance on what they do, and you're caught. So there are answers, but we are going to have to work together to figure out how we want to spend our money and not be drug over the cliff on the pensions, but begin to be proactive in terms of how we manage it.
Well, so you mentioned in your comments up there, right, some of the distinct challenges in some of the municipalities. And look, that's made national news here out of California, right? How have the various kind of local, let me just call them local governments, right, the various suite there, how have they fared in particular since the Great Recession? Are there more of those, are there more Socktons kind of looming around the corner?
Well, as a bankruptcy lawyer, I always like to say no to that answer. Because there's a sort of a bias against bankruptcy in the municipal world, and for a lot of good reasons, particularly if you look at Puerto Rico as the poster child for everything that should never happen in a bankruptcy. But the bottom line is in California, since the Stockton case, we've had a roadmap in terms of how to deal with CalPERS. And for those of you in the CalPERS systems, that roadmap says once you're in a bankruptcy, that termination fee goes away. And I keep saying to my clients, talk to your bondholders out of court if you have bondholders, because the bondholders, last thing they want to do, and I represent a lot of them, is be in a restructuring in a court. They could probably give you relief in terms of interest rate, extension of due date. But the fact of the matter is, if you can't get anything done that works for 3 to 5 year period, and you have to think in small periods because you're not going to fix it in one big shot, then you should be okay with approaching a bankruptcy court on a business proposition. One of the things when we wrote AB 506, that was sort of the thought process, is get everybody in a room and say, okay, you got a shot to negotiate to something we can live with for the short term, or we can go into bankruptcy and we can all deal with what the judge might do. So I think that we're going to have to be more proactive, particularly those municipalities that are facing negative cash flow in the next 24 months. There are a lot of them out there, and you could see an increase in bankruptcy, although I think that would be really sad because you wouldn't have taken advantage of the mediation process and some of the other things that are available to you.
Yeah, and Tom, are you concerned in your region at all on this, or do you feel like you all have economic tailwinds to make the investments you need?
I wouldn't say economic tailwinds. Growth has been fairly stagnant there. However, our cities and our county is going to be challenged in this budget, but they're always challenged. Our cities have certainly weathered the storm after the Great Recession, and I don't see any looming bankruptcies.
That's great. That's great. And Marty, do you feel like in particular, whether Southern California, you've worked in Northern California too, right? Do you think they can make the needed investments to the kind of, frankly, let's call them, instead of global cities, global metro areas that they are, right? Can they make the investments to scale that they need, especially as they continue to have strong industry and population-based growth, though?
Around California, the single most important investment in transportation infrastructure has resulted from local option sales taxes, where the populace has voted, and we require a 2/3 majority, and they have voted to impose sales taxes in 26 of the state's 53 counties, and they are the most populous county, so they account for about almost 90% of the population of the state. So people, when they see that they get value for money, when these ballot measures say, we're going to build these 4 projects and we're going to charge you this amount of money, and the project's going to be built locally and they're going to be built in this order, people seem to be willing to tax themselves a bit more in order to get those services. So I'm reasonably optimistic. It's more the county than it is the municipalities within the county, but they tend to collaborate on those ballot measures.
That's great. And now, Karol, you mentioned too in your speech that some of these places are pushing up against their kind of, let's call it a natural sales tax cap, right, of what the local economy can bear. So, and Marty, just for everyone in the room too, these are incredibly popular around the country, but really it is the California votes that have gotten the most national attention, with right behind it most recently in Seattle too, right? So these are really popular, but is there a limit to them? Are we seeing this as now, look, LA County has theirs in the books for what, after the most recent vote for like 90 years or something absurd? I mean, longer than all of our lifetimes,
it's permanent, right? and it's 2% sales tax when you add up 4 measures since 1980, and they are mostly permanent. One of them is not yet permanent, but 3 of the 4 are. And yes, I think there is a limit. And one of the downsides of this is that in order to get the votes, the 2/3 of the vote, they listed so many attractive projects that they incur more financial obligations in order to get the votes needed to build the projects that are most important. So as soon as Measure M passed, and it will raise over $200 billion over the next 40 years, people said, well, it's not enough money to build all the projects that we've promised, and we have to go for more money. So it's a cycle that repeats itself.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, do you all have any feelings on this? Yeah, I was gonna.
Well, one piece of this, it's been so successful in California that the sales tax measures that have been largely reserved for transportation purposes are now being used by local agencies, local cities, to fund police, fire, and everything else. So to your point that there is a cap, yeah, and it's being filled in by local agencies, and maybe this special funding source that we in our field have used for so long will be less effective in the future if we're rising that high.
I think that's right. I mean, to the extent that there were increases in sales tax proposed to help deal with pensions, we've seen a lot of municipalities, taxpayers vote them down. And I think that as they push higher and higher up and cities get more desperate, you're going to have a harder time getting increased taxes to deal with pensions until you actually begin to deal with the pension problem. I think if voters see traction, then that attitude may change. But right now, the response of the voters when they've been interviewed is, I'm not giving you more money to put after, good money after bad, number one. And number two, there's no transparency. I don't really know what you're doing with the money anyway. And by the way, I'm not happy with the governance. And that's why you've seen so many politically active groups supporting people that are in favor of pension reform on the ballots.
So I'm going to ask one more question, then I want to make sure everyone is starting to think about theirs, so you get a chance. I want to talk about one other relative time bomb, if it's fair to say it like that as an outsider, of what's going to happen with broadly speaking, the environmental health of the state, but especially around the long-run drought, right? And water resources are so essential to this state, complicated past, right? How do we kind of see these all blending together in terms of there has been so much of this state has been powered historically by greenfield residential development of nothing of the commercial and industrial that follows it too. Are those sustainable patterns? And how do you all see it intersecting with the financial side here, right? Can we afford to continue to see the state grow and maintain the kind of, have the kind of smart environmental policies that we're seeing in your region of the state, Tom? Or is this something that it's similar to what you were saying in 2008, 2009, right, around pensions, that it's still a little bit, we're not sure at the state level what to do about it?
Yeah, and my sense is the state will grow water, air. We have a number of environmental and public resource distribution issues. And in the state, there is a lot of water. Who has it and where it's going is an ongoing challenge, right, Phil? In our region, we're scene of the largest agriculture to urban water transfer in the nation, and I suspect that solutions like that will continue to change where water is flowing, and obviously climate change is going to factor into that as well, but I don't think those factors are going to limit growth. They might limit the type of growth in some ways, but not substantially. And you look at California, it's the most urban state in the nation. Los Angeles uses far less resources, water, electricity, and other things than many other urban areas. We actually do a fairly good job, and it's a compact urban environment. We have very few rural areas. To Marty's point about sales tax counties, and 90% of the population probably lives within 7 counties in this state. So I see more of the same in the future, and certainly allocation will have to change to meet growing demand.
I think that's right. I think it's an allocation issue, just like everything else. And sometimes my head explodes when I think about the decisions that people have to make in terms of trying to manage water, infrastructure, and pensions. And you look at the funding that's available to do so, and you look at some of our classic failures in this state. For example, we have one of the worst public to private statutes in the country. And we certainly haven't figured out how to move to the next level, but I think as the discussion continues about allocation and the fact that we have critical needs on infrastructure and water, I think the other piece of this that's going to play into it is that California is not all about the big Los Angeles, San Francisco, San Diego areas. We've got a tremendous challenge on those communities that are in the eastern part of the state, and some of them have been hardest hit by both the water issues, the infrastructure issues. I would add healthcare because I now have 6 healthcare bankruptcies, hospital districts, and I think that one of the other problems that we're going to have to address as a state is how we allocate resources to those areas that are less successful economically. So that's why my head explodes when I start thinking about things like this conference. It's because how do we ever figure out how to educate the voters and how to get people to be in a position to prioritize what's the most important thing? And I'll just kind of close with this. My heart breaks every time we end up in a situation where retirees get stripped of medical care. Because is that really who we are as a country or a city or a municipality? To leave people with no medical coverage at all. in exchange for what? And I think that we just need better management in terms of how we allocate, better communication, and as Chuck Reed will tell you, I hope later today, more transparency.
I would just like to add this issue of environment and sustainability is enormously complex, but it's a very real current problem. And the example I would give is California high-speed rail system. We have embarked on building a $75 billion rail system to connect at high speed Sacramento, San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Diego. The first train won't run till 2032, according to the latest plan, but we're already under construction. And the environmental impacts of the construction project are being handled beautifully. But the project will induce sprawl, just the way the interstate highway system did. They're actually saying people can live in Merced and work in Santa Clara because the train is so fast. That would mean sprawl in Merced. And what we're not doing quite yet, and I keep banging on the table and saying we have to do it, is worry about the land use planning in places like the Central Valley, which is such a rich agricultural resource for us. If it were to be overrun by single-family homes, then the high-speed rail program, which is intended to bring environmental benefits, it's all electric and all of that, will actually be doing environmental harm. We must get on that.
Well, the good thing is the high-speed rail program is not contentious at all, so don't have that to worry about. So we've got about 10 minutes left. I'm not sure if there's microphones or not. The acoustics, there are, but the acoustics in here are great. So for anyone who has a question, honestly, raise your hand. It's not, we're pretty intimate here, so I can see you, and happy to ask. Yeah, this.
Yes, in the interest of disclosure, BB&K is our firm of choice at my district here. One thing I didn't hear you touch on, this is a definitely eminent panel for this question, is for the last decade, the state in its scramble for sources of revenue has been attempting to come with a social justice charge known as the public goods service charge. And they first initially tried to find a social issue at which to connect it to, and as you know, the debilitating results of the drought in the Central Valley has indicated that recently the legislature, in its wisdom, has declared that social services are a human right in the state, whether it is health care or access to water or access to transportation. And as I understand, this public goods service charge is going to be imposed in a budget trailer bill coming between now and probably the end of the legislative session in August. What type of impact is that going to have on our local government services and the conflict it has with the statutory limitations of the services we provide can only be charged for? And this is an outside charge coming from the state that's being mandated.
I don't know anything about it. So
I hope you do, because the Western growers, to escape environmental litigation, has agreed with this methodology and have actually offered up about 20% of what it would take to do environmental mitigation against the contamination of salts and nitrates in the agricultural areas.
Karol, do you have anything on this? No. Yeah, I think this is actually one of my first. We've actually stumped a panel, so that's really good. And it means I think hopefully you'll get a chance to ask someone else who's an expert on this, in between the sessions, and I would push someone to respond. Although I'm not sure if right now is the best place, right? So, but let's go to another question.
Carrie Ferguson from San Juan Capistrano. I was interested in your comment on the public-private statutes. If you were rewriting it, what are some of the things you would include?
I think that primarily what needs to be done is in the bidding process where you bring in your public sector and your private sector clients. One of the best ways to get a handle on what's wrong with our statutes is to look at the World Bank Handbook on public to private. Europe is a much better model for how public to private has been implemented and used for the last 20, 25 years. Part of the reason for that is there's one decision maker in our country. We have city, county, state often involved in that process. So there's a difficulty in, I think from a legal perspective, getting bidders interested. I know when our clients bid, the bidding process costs them a fairly large investment. And then it's very unclear as to how the decisions are made. Oftentimes the proposals are not economic in the sense for the private sector. It doesn't generate sufficient funds. And then the last thing I would say is that I think the public to private statutes need to better address the realistic projections that come with any project. As you may know, there have been a number of highways that have been in bankruptcy as a result of overly optimistic projections. So I think there's a lot of things that could be done to make it easier and more attractive for the private sector to want to invest funds and want to work with the public sector on large projects. I mean, the overbidding and how you manage the bidding process, and then the actual implementation, the fact that very few of these projects come in on the original projections makes it almost impossible for a private sector client that has to turn a profit and deal with all the stuff that comes now on an annual basis. If it was something we could look at over a longer term, it would probably be much easier, but it's very hard for the private sector to participate, which is why we're very interested in watching what's happening in New Jersey, because there's been a lot of input into the proposed statute that they're looking at.
Okay, I think we have time for 2 more questions. This gentleman back here.
Well, getting back on the PERS scenario here, Don Parker from the city of Montclair. And obviously for the last, 3-4 years, every time we turn around, CalPERS does something to increase the rates. There's no relief from that. Looking at the rates going up, $800 to $1 million a year on that. The city I come from, the rates have doubled over the last 3 or 4 years in total the amount we're paying on that. That's a city of 36,000 population, mostly Hispanic population. At what point in time, or is there something on the horizon when CalPERS's board is going to finally see the light that is killing the goose that laid the golden egg? And at some point in time, are they going to be starting to force more and more cities into bankruptcy to get to that? At what point do you think there's ever going to be a realization on CalPERS's part they can't balance their own books on the backs of the cities?
Well, I think if you were to just look at the numbers, and we look at cities like the one you're talking about, you have a number of them that are going to run out of money in terms of being able to pay CalPERS increased cost in the next 3 years. In terms of trying to predict when CalPERS gets it, I'm at a loss, because I have been up to CalPERS.
So are we, unfortunately.
I've been up to CalPERS. I can't tell you how many times to try to talk to them about the financial reality that, X minus Y equals negative X. But I do think, and I've said this to a lot of cities, that there is room to get somebody up in Sacramento banging on doors saying, hey, we need to relook at this. But the ugly picture on the other side is that CalPERS has had terrible investment years back to back, and there is no accountability under statute for CalPERS in terms of its decisions. And so we need to, redo the CalPERS statute, and I've argued to the point that people are like, okay, we get it. CalPERS needs a sick muni program. In other words, we need a program where we can put distressed municipalities in for some period of time where they get relief from those contributions while they sort it out. Because there's a number of places you can sort it out in a restructuring, that's what we do. But CalPERS has so far refused to even consider such a program, and I think part of that comes from their fear that they're really, Brown has said this, so I can cop to say I heard him say it, it's a Ponzi scheme. And they're terrified that if they can't get the money in from everybody that owes it, they're not going to have enough for the money going out. So it's a complex problem, but it needs discussion, and there are solutions that don't require everybody to be in bankruptcy, which would be a terrible result. And I say that because the bankruptcies cost more than they ever should, so that's an added financial burden. So I think that the message that needs to go to Sacramento on behalf of everybody that's looking at a cash flow problem is we need some kind of program set up to deal with the reality of this.
I think this is a great way to set the tone for the day, so I really want to thank all of you for taking the time and coming down here. So join me in thanking them for setting the tone.